here, which will start sprinkling this a repetition from last time, because maybe some people are still coming from the transcription course, which is just finishing up at 9:45, so we have some more. So please recap. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and he hopes that this is really satisfying. Now, that's because of me. Why is it sort of unexpected or funny maybe? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So the first one is that we would expect from Wonderland, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, in falling, but fall, of course, in American English goes on, it goes in the season. And also this winter, that's how we contextualize it, and it will be just satisfying. So what, in terms of linguistics, what do we have between this meaning of fall? How does fall? They're not specifically
Oh, no, I think
right? Yeah. What we call if something has two meanings. Both meanings in this case, if we have nothing, so if we have both, we say ambi. Like if I can write the full sentence as ambidextrous, in this case has both meanings, that's ambiguity, right? So in this case, we now do last week for the session on semantics. So in this case, we have semantic ambiguity. This fall and the other fall, the season fall, have different meanings, they just look the same, right? But today is not on semantics anymore, today is on syntax. So we have 4 sessions in total on syntax, and today we are dealing with the first one, which is the basics, the things that we'll need for the other ones, where we'll deal with 3 different approaches: formal approaches, functional approaches, and cognitive approaches. And you'll notice that especially when it comes to cognitive approaches, a lot of the semantics will come back to us. So if you have that ready for the last session, that will help you. So today is syntax, grammar, and theories about them. After all, this is the syntax lesson. We'll deal with some general principles and also discuss how general they really are. And then we'll recap some selected elements of English syntax. As we said, syntax, grammar, so far I haven't really disambiguated them. So back to semantic ambiguity. What different meanings does the word grammar actually have? I have at least 3 out there. What do you think of the word grammar? What can it mean? No, that's really good. I love this. What did you say? Connected teaching of language. That's beautiful. I love it. And that is sort of the second thing here at unfortunately, I think not to take it on in the right order. So this is the second one which I would say is like an abstract concept. The thing that binds elements of language together actually much more nicer for everybody. What other meanings are there for grammar? Like, have you ever had someone say, oh, can you have anything longer grammar over there? What do I mean then? Or if you're at school, if you're a teacher, you might do the Murphy grammar. Could you bring in the Murphy grammar to me? What do I mean then?
Reference book?
A reference book, yes, exactly. So we can also say that a book that contains information about grammatical rules and patterns, those we also call it grammar. They think in language analysis we make a distinction between pedagogical grammar for students and reference grammar for linguists. Yeah. What else? Yeah. So the And if you read your Plaque book, you can already see that grammar, there he defines it as an abstract system, includes more than just the order of words. So Plaque says it's a complete system of phonological, morphological, syntactic, and semantic information and rules that speakers of a given language possess. So in this sense, grammar then overlaps with syntax. But it's not the same. And syntax basically is the arrangement of words. And that this arrangement carries meaning becomes very obvious immediately when you look at the difference between Peter beats Tom and Tom beats Peter. Very different, right? In terms of meaning. And something tells us, and this is this abstract system that we know about the English language, that beats Peter Tom doesn't work in English. In German, of course, it would work. Schlägt Peter Tom? Because there it would become the interrogative. But in English, you can't really do that. So what we're talking about is well-formed phrases, clauses, and sentences and how they are put together. And that is basically what syntax is. So we can say Peter meets Tom, who is his oldest friend, but Peter, Tom, who is oldest his friend meets, doesn't really work for us. So you can see that these syntactical rules, these rules of ordering, don't only apply to the entire sentence, but also within a phrase, we have certain rules. And of course, those differ between languages. Some languages call for some things, others for others. So, if we talk about grammar in the narrow sense, as many linguists would define it, we say grammar then is syntax, this word ordering, but also inflectional morphology. Somebody remind me, please, what was inflectional morphology and what was the other type of morphology we talked about? Yes?
Inflectional and derivational morphology. Basic differences that inflectional morphology is problematic practices, if I remember correctly. For example, singular consonant, plural, whatever. And derivational morphology can create new word classes.
Yeah, only word classes, but we definitely remember that. Wonderful. So, derivational morphology, the other one, is when I have a change in word class, but sometimes only also a change in meaning. So if I have happy, unhappy, that forms a new word, that's dividing a new word, so it's derivational morphology, where you create a new word, and that's definitely semantics. But as you rightly said, inflectional morphology, that's when I have past tense, or gerunds, or plural, so things that are more grammatically, and that then obviously is part of grammar, together with syntax. And then we say, okay, so morpho-syntax then is our grammar. But depending on the theory you work with, you could say, as Plaque did, that grammar includes all kinds of morphology, and it can even include word formation processes and derivational morphology because meaning is relevant to grammar. And that depends on what kind of approach and what kind of theory you deal with. Which is why I'm going to give you a brief, extremely simplified sort of history lessons on these different grammar approaches that we talked about. And I want to say that I'm not a historian by a long shot. So this is more a narrative than a history lesson. And if you have knowledge on this, chime in at any time. But what I want to give you is a concept of why we teach you different theories and what these different theories mean, where they come from, why we have them. Yeah, and for that you need this little bit of history right here. So what it started out with originally, this issue of linguistics, is a very descriptive study of language. And a lot of times even language, just knowledge of language. If you read Sherlock Holmes, the originals, you'll find that a linguist is simply a person who knows many languages. And what they started out with, those linguists, is actually they were anthropologists who started to describe individual languages, and then also how words changed. And then the guy came along whom you probably heard of, Ferdinand de Saussure. Anything you remember about Saussure? Anything from your previous classes? Yeah. Yes. Signifier. Perfect. Beautiful. So, any sign, any word, sort of the concept it describes, but also the form it is, and goes together, the signifier, the word, and the signified structuralism or structural linguistics sort of involved. So he was sort of the first structuralist. And the idea behind structural linguistics was that, okay, we have to go away from this purely descriptive, what is happening here, what is happening there bit. We need rigorous scientific methods where we look at what each tone in the system does, where they are placed, and we describe that. And especially when that was taken over in the US by Leonard Bloomfield, amongst others, but many other structuralists, behaviorism came in here. So the idea that, okay, language is learned just as anything else, like rats in the Skinner box, 5 patterns that we take up, that we repeat by being rewarded for what we do, by our communication being successful, and so on and so forth. And this was modern, sort of the beginning of linguistics as we understand it today. But there was also, with time, a lot of critique of that. For example, that, okay, Saussure says there's langue and parole, but what does he actually do with the difference? He gives things names. He says, okay, this is the sign, and here's the signifier and the signified. But what do they actually then do with each other? So there are a lot of categories, but not a lot of focus on meaning. Not a lot of focus on how we then actually produce communication. And then, if there is something like parole, how do we deal with the messiness that comes when we actually talk? And our talking, of course, is very different in a way from our writing. And you'll see this come up more often, this idea of how do we deal with the actual messiness of language. And there was also a lot of critique for the fact that if it's all behavioristically learned, how can we come up with sentences that nobody has ever uttered before? How can we contextualize sentences that we've never heard in that way? And there were 2 larger developments that come out of that, many smaller as well. I'm going to first deal with functional linguistics. So here you have the UK and the Dutch representative for functional linguistics, Michael Holliday and Simon Dick. And they said, okay, let's look at parole then. Let's look at what language use actually is. And if we say it's use, well, what is the purpose actually of language? What is its function? Well, that's probably to communicate. So let's actually look at the communicative functions of every bit. Not so much of, like the meaning of each word or morpheme, but what it actually communicates. So they saw language as, or see still language as a tool. And we want to see what the structures that are in this language and what their functions are. Thus it's called functional linguistics. And more or less at the same time, actually a bit earlier, in the US, formal linguistics came along, also in response to structural linguistics, especially the Bloomfieldian theory. And you've probably heard the name of Noam Chomsky before at least. He was the loudest and clearest critic of what Bloomfield and his colleagues did, criticizing all these things and trying to bring about what he called a cognitive revolution. So he was much more interested in saying, okay, language is such a human cognitive thing. How does it actually work? How do I have these concepts like somebody and then a building and then the action between? So I have this deep structure of Tom built a house, but how do I actually arrive at what I say then? And how do I arrive at something that is very similar in meaning, like the house was built by Tom, from the same structure, because in my head, the same things are going on, right? But 2 different forms come out. How does that actually work? He wanted to bring about a new focus on meaning, similar to the functionalists, and he looked at it, and that might have to do also with the fact that he worked at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which also had a big neuroscience department. So a lot of biolinguistics, a lot of ideas of what's actually going on then. did that very enthusiastically, I want to say for one thing. It was one of the first to really raise passion about linguistics, supposedly, loudly, critically, some say obnoxiously. And this is something you have to understand in order to get that these approaches that we're going to be presenting, on the one hand, they can coexist because they look at different things. On the other hand, they're sometimes very heated enemies of each other and will reject each other's ideas because there's so much emotion also going on. I mean, Chomsky is said to have yelled out in lectures by Bloomfieldians that this is all bullshit and had called them liars and idiots. And this is sort of how he established himself. But he brought modern linguistics to this world, and he brought new ideas to this world that we still use today and that have sparked up many interesting theories. But he was not the last one, of course. Formal linguistics was equally criticized, especially, again, for how do you deal with messiness? Because at some point, formal linguistics became also very formalistic. So we tried to be rigorous, scientific, we tried to give everything its category and tell how they blend together and merge together. But then again, you can be criticized for complexity of what we do language use in everyday language, in Taiwan if you want to. How do you deal also with the complexness of word meaning? Like the two falls we have, but also the fact that if I use a verb like drink, sometimes I might use it with like I drink. But usually I would probably say I drink water or I'm drinking a glass of water or something like that. Because the sentence I drink sometimes implies that I'm an alcoholic, right? So she drinks. That's sort of worrying. How do you account for this? How do you account for the fact that these two have one form with very different patterns and then very different meanings? And the cognitive reality that Noam Chomsky originally wanted was called into question as well. So do I really use all these many rules of how an affix hops from one place to another? Does my brain really do that? And out of that arose cognitive linguistics, one of the first proponents of which was George Lakoff, who also worked at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and incidentally started really driving his theory forward when Noam Chomsky was on a sabbatical at Berkeley. So when the field was sort of clear, he brought out his own theory. And when Chomsky came back, again, there was heated battle. So what Chomsky had done to the Bloomfieldians, now the cognitive grammar group around Lakoff and Ross and others did the same to him. And they were equally impolite. And I want to read a little bit to you so you get a feeling for that. This is an account written by Randy Harris, who summed up this development of theories of linguistics by collecting anecdotes from different people and collecting old papers. And this is, for example, what Lakoff has to say about Chomsky. So, in one lecture, Chomsky took up Macaulay's paper on respectively, and he put forth the argument that Macaulay was arguing against Macaulay's position. And he himself put forth the position that Macaulay was arguing for. And he said, see how dumb Macaulay is. There were 100 people presenting, and I raised my hand and said, no, you've got it wrong. You've got the position reversed. He said, no, I'll read you the text. And he read a bunch of things out of context. Of course, nobody in the room had the text except him. I just got curious about it. The following week, he took a paper of mine and did the same thing. He put forth as my position a position I specifically am saying. And then he argued correctly against his position. And I said, no, I specifically did not give that position in my paper. Now that's Lakoff's view. Other people have portrayed this a little different, saying, Lakoff would sit in the back row and just say, wrong, you're wrong, everything you say is wrong. Or the typical scenario at Chomsky's course would be that Chomsky would say something, then Robin Lakoff, that was the later wife of George Lakoff, who was pathologically shy but smart, would whisper into George's ear, then George would raise his head and in this smarmy, pseudo-civil way make some comment. So what you can see is that there was really a little bit of a war going on. And these emotions that come with it, the personal insults, the things that go beyond argumentation in a proper sense, they play a role in the different approaches we have nowadays. So what Lakoff tried to perpetuate is that we have to have more meaning focus, which is a bit ironic because Chomsky originally said, let's have more meaning, and then people say, no, we need more meaning. But he especially dealt with, or deals still with, conceptualizations of words and conceptualizations of patterns. He strongly argues against the language acquisition device, because he says everything in language is usage-based, we have so much input, and we can't abstract rules and patterns from input, thereby creating novel things. And he also says that language is a uniquely human thing that is embodied, that we relate everything to our experience. Whereas Chomsky's theory also, I mean, he's at MIT, still is, has been used a lot for artificial intelligence and artificial language production. So what I want to get from that is, one, if you're interested in this, ask for this book for Christmas. I mean, it's not the fastest page turn, but it is a really fun and personal account of what happened, and it will help you in your understanding of linguistics. But also, that this was, on the one hand, a development that grew out of people criticizing things that the theory lacked, but also that these were in confrontation and sparked of different theories because they looked at different things. It matters if I want to say, okay, I'm interested in how do I get from the concept in my head to the formulation of the sentence. Or I'm interested in word meaning and how that contributes to grammar. Or I'm interested in how is a communication structure. And all of them feel that their way is what really makes language. And on a lower level, we're of course all aware of the fact that all of them are, contribute to language. But the question is, which ones are the significant ones? So you have many theories that came out of the formal approach, the functional approach, the cognitive approach. Even the structural approach is still around, for example, in the form of head-driven phrase, structured grammar, which is somewhere in between those two. And we'll therefore also teach you three different theories, or the sort of first insight into three different theories. So X-bar theory for generative grammar, systemic functional grammar for functional approaches, and cognitive grammar for the cognitive approaches. That's going to be our next three lessons. And for that, you have to be aware of the fact that they think there are different things there in language. So if I believe that there is a language acquisition device, only then can I try to study that, right? The fact that I believe in it also matters in terms of what I can actually find out about language. And in a way also how I can find out. Let's think back briefly to language analysis. What are the three ways you discussed there? How can we investigate language? How can we find out about language? Yeah.
Investigation, introspection, and cognitive.
Perfect. Introspection. So I look into myself and think, I can say she is happy, but I cannot say she happy is. What does that tell me about language? And this is a very legitimate way of going about it, because we all have this abstract system. Then there is elicitation. I can say, what do you say? Especially if I investigate a regional variety or anything really, but especially if it's something where I might not be the only expert on it, and there might be variation. And then the third one is basically having a large database like the corpus, where I look at a language sample that's representative and I say, okay, what's going on here? And these might differ depending on what I believe here. If I believe that language uses something that is important and I want to see how we produce meaning together, how the issues, like the bits I have, function in communication, then introspection will maybe not happen that much. Then I really need many signals. If I believe that it's about what's going on in my head, how do I write strong into bits at a sentence, then introspection is great and I don't need anything else, right? So, in a bit more philosophical terms, we call that the things we believe that are there are ontology. From that, we get an epistemology. So, if I believe it is there, this is what we can possibly find out, but what we find out is also limited by our own cognitive abilities. That is my epistemology, and my methodology, that is, do I do introspection, do I do elicitation, what do I actually do? If you adhere to one of those theories, many of these things are presumed. If you do your own work and you don't work with the syntactic theory or approach, then if you do a study, you have to make clear what you believe is there and how you find out about it and what your methodology is and why, because otherwise that's not clear. Yeah, and I think we're gonna... No, we have time. We still have time. Okay. The next 15 slides are sort of an excursion into how do we find out. If they help you, wonderful. If not, then we've had some fun with animals and that's it. Okay? So this is a little experiment. But I want to explain to you how it is that we get at language in so many different approaches. So let's assume this is language, which we cannot really easily get at, because we're part of it, we produce it all the time, it's very tricky to pin down. So it's sort of a black box. And all we can do is perform studies. So let's say this is my study one. This is what I find out about what is behind this black box or in this black box language. What do we see? If I make this really simple, let's say we're in primary school and I say, tell me, what do you see? Rectangles, yeah, sure. They're sort of rectangles, yeah? And if she says rectangle, that is of course a pretty good interpretation, right? Because a rectangle is something that you learn about, because it's fixed. If you are really strict with yourself and you want to just describe, you say, okay, there's light and then there's a contrast and something dark, and even light and dark are rectangles. And we can see that there's contrast. And if we talk about lines and rectangles, we even go a bit beyond it, but we need these words to describe. And this is what we're going to be doing in the last half hour of today, is learning words like rectangle for linguistics. So these basic descriptional units. So let's say we have described this as our linguist, and then we from this side. What do we see? An eye. Yay. And again, an eye is even more already an interpretation than the abstractions we originally had, right? Because it's sort of an oval shape, light, dark, something. But because of the things we know about the world, we interpret, I think that's an eye. And that's a reasonable assumption, right? Then we have another study, and maybe now we have a theory. What is the entire picture? What is language in this case? What do you see? Yeah. A dot. Yes. And therefore, we might actually hypothesize. What do we think we'll find here? A bee. Yeah, there we are. And that's our idea of vocabulary. And now we are adhering to the theory that language is up. Right? But of course, we could have done a different thing. We could have started out with this study again. But then we might have conducted this study. And then maybe that. Do we now have a new theory of language? What could we do? Yeah. Arabic, indeed. So if we say, if our hypothesis is language is Arabic, and we conduct the same study time, what do we expect to get? Here's text, indeed. And that's the tricky thing, that we can investigate the same thing, look at the same study results, and based on what we know on now to the categorizations and categories of descriptions. So we'll skip this bit. Most of which you know from language analysis, grammar use, or introduction to the study of language 1. So this is a review, and I hope you'll help me review a little bit, because I think most of this will be familiar to you. First one is 2 bits of language. I'd like you to read them and figure out what the difference between them sort of is. Yeah. The first one's spoken and the second one is written. Do we all agree? Yeah, very likely, right? Mrs. Brown, leaving really the best we've ever had. I mean, what next? Doesn't really feel like written language. Where is the other one? Clearly rather written. So this bulk of text in spoken language, what would we call that? And what do we call it in written language? Maybe that's easier. What is it? What's the name we have for that? Very simple. A sentence, yes. Now, in spoken language, sentence is so tricky, because where does it start, where does it end? So in spoken language, we would rather refer to an utterance, something that somebody uttered. So these are the largest units we're dealing with here now, utterance and sentence. Now, especially the sentence we can break up in smaller parts, right? What do we call the next smallest part of the sentence? Yeah. The clause, indeed, yes. Take a second, maybe together with your neighbor, chat about it. How many clauses do I have in the sentence below there? And sort of where do they start, where do they end? Oh, yeah. Okay, who's got more than 3? More than 4? More than 5? More than 6? Okay, so 6 was the most, and I would agree. Sorry. I've got 6 clauses here. Why? Because every verb that sort of stands on its own, not auxiliary verbs. So if you have an auxiliary verb and also the other verbs that go with it. But every verb makes a clause. So here I have hearing, here I have realized, here I have was, we ever had, did not know, and to do. These are our 6 clauses. And there's a difference though between the 2 yellow ones and the other ones. What's the difference between them? Yep. Perfect. Those are the main clauses and they can stand on their own. Now, the tricky thing is that, of course, sometimes the main clause also needs to be with the subordinate clause, right? We suddenly realize, but if I have a one-word substitution for the rest of the clause, then that's still my main clause. Many people will say that actually it's a matrix clause that goes all the way there, but this is the important thing. So this is the main clause. 2 main clauses, and then 4 that cannot stand on their own. So those are subordinate clauses. Or we can also call these dependent clauses and independent clauses. Now, let's look at the different verbs, especially in the dependent clauses, in the subordinate clauses. What is the difference between like hearing and to do, and then on the other hand, realize, was, had, did? Remember the concept of a finite verb versus an infinite or non-finite verb. Yeah? So the ones that can tell the tense at, so realize, had, did, those we call finite verbs, the tense ones, and the other ones are non-finite. clauses, of course, always have to have a finite verb, right? So you can see how well we can work with this. We can split it apart and split it up. Other answers are much trickier. But especially lately, when corpora has been gathered using spoken language, a lot of study actually has been done on utterances as well, because we do realize that really spoken language is primary. This is what we use most, this is how we learn and acquire a first language, and this is also where language change happens mostly, because the written language is standardized and codified, and the spoken language is much more fluid. So for these reasons, actually, utterances are extremely interesting. They're just much more tricky to deal with. So we'll focus, since we're talking about basics here, mostly on sentences today. I keep freaking at the screen. Yeah, so independent clauses can be finite or non-finite, and sometimes they're even verbless, like things like the Queen of Hearts who says, off with the head. There's not really a verb in there, right? But it's still somehow a clause. Now, sentences have to have at least one clause, and there are different types depending on what clauses they do have. So in this little riddle, I'd like you to now find out which are the dependent and independent clauses, where are the finite, non-finite verbs, and if you remember, think of what sentence types do we have here, because we have finite or non-finite or two finite or two main clauses, two subordinate clauses, or a main union clause, and maybe you could think of the answer to the riddle. Again, if you work with a partner, sometimes you come up with more things. I encourage it. Okay, so how about the first one? What kind of clauses do I have in there? Yeah. Perfect. Sorry, you see too much here anyways, but wonderful. So we have the person doesn't want it. That's our main clause. But there's a relative clause in there. Who invented it? Two verbs. Invent and doesn't want, so must be two clauses, right? How about the second one then? Tom bought it, but he doesn't need it. What kind of clauses do I have? Dependent or independent? Or both? Yes, two independent clauses, two main clauses, with a but in between. And but we call the coordinator, right? So coordinators coordinate clauses rather than subordinate them. How about despite needing it urgently, Larry will never hold it in his hands? What do I have here? What is despite needing it urgently? Is that independent or dependent? That's a dependent one, yes, a subordinate one. And how about Larry will never hold it in his hands? Independent, yes, has to be, right? Because I have to at least have one independent one. And in order to solve the riddle, what is it then? Any ideas? Hypotheses? A coffin. So what is, it is a coffin then, main clause or subordinate clause? Must be a main clause, yes, indeed. And I've underlined needing in here because needing is our one non-finite verb. Yes, all the other ones in here are finite. Okay, sentence types then. So in the first one we said we have both a main clause and a subordinate clause. What do we call that kind of sentence? We call these complex sentences because they're made up of a main clause and one that's sort of embedded into it. So it's more complex than, for example, the second one, which is two main clauses coordinated by a but. What do we call those? Compound sentences. So like compound words made up of two nouns or something, this is a compound sentence made up of two main clauses. Then we have again a subordinate clause and a main clause, so again that's a complex sentence. And if these are complex, what is just a main clause then? Really simple, it is simple. Okay? These are the different sentence types we will deal with. Yeah. So sentences are made up of clauses. What are clauses then made up of? What's the next smallest unit you remember from whatever? Yeah. Phrases, indeed. What are phrases made up of? Words, yeah, perfect. So this is what we call the hierarchy of levels. Clauses, phrases, words. Now clauses, phrases, and words, they together... okay, we have a little bit more on that, sorry. So obviously on the top. If we look at a sentence like the student follows the lecture, the whole thing is obviously the clause. How many phrases do we have? Who says 1? Who says 2? Who says 3? Who says 4? Okay, I'd go with 3 phrases. The lecture being the smallest one, follow the lecture, the next biggest, and then we have the student. And why this is one verb phrase we'll discuss a little later on. And then last but not least, we have words. Not going to ask you how many words there are in this sentence. But you know that there are different types of words, right? Word classes, also called syntactic classes, also called parts of speech, which is sometimes abbreviated to POS. If you ever work with the corpus, you'll hear POS a lot. There's post added. That means to tell you what word classes is. So what word classes do we have here? What is the? Yeah, say it. An article, yes, there's another word also for article. Starts with a D. Determiner, yes. How about students? Noun, yes. Follow. The. And lecture, perfect. And as I said, these are syntactic classes, word classes, parts of speech. These words can be used interchangeably. Depending on what approach you adhere to, you might use a different word, but really they mean the same thing. So all of these, the clauses, the phrases, and the words, they are sort of the bits that make up a sentence or an utterance. And in language analysis, you also learn the term for all these bits, which starts with a C. Does anyone remember? Constituents, indeed. Constituents. And constituents are often, constituency tests actually, are often what we use to figure out, okay, where do I break this up? Where is a phrase? Where is a word? What do we do here? So in order to review some of those constituency tests, I've got a couple of sentences here for you, or actually one sentence mainly. Burglar Bill burgled the museum last night. And I've given you 5 constituency tests here. Maybe together with your neighbors, see if you can remember what they do, why they tell me what's a constituent, and maybe even what they're named, because usually the name is very closely linked to the function. Okay, so how about the first one? He burgled it then. What do we do there? Yep, it's the substitution test. So if I want to see if something is a constituent, then I should possibly theoretically be able to substitute it by one proform, by one pronoun. So burglar Bill, he, the museum, it, and when, last night, then. If I can substitute it by one proform, then it's very likely that this is a constituent. How about burglar Bill did so? Yeah, that's the substitution for verb phrase. Very well done. That takes two words, sort of. But again, we can represent everything that comes after burglar Bill basically by one concept. And that shows us that this entire verb phrase really also is one thing. And it encompasses more than burgle. It's really that it burgled the museum, even last night, that happens to burgle Bill in that instance. So that's our substitution verb phrase, and that shows us that this is a constituent. How about what did he burgle? The museum. What happens here? What do I make? What's the first bit? The question, yes. This is the question. It needs the word fragment here. So, sorry. Sentence fragment. So this is the question or sentence fragment test. So can this bit stand on its own as one fragment as the answer to the question? So for the museum, I can also ask who burgled the museum last night? Burglar Bill. But it's very difficult to ask, for example, for the or Bill burgled. There's nothing that Bill burgled can be the answer to. So Bill burgled probably is not a constituent. Then we have last night the museum was burgled by burglar Bill. What am I doing here? Changing word order, yes. So I move things around, and in this case I do it in the form of passivization. So the things that move together, for example, when I make it the subject of a passive sentence, that is a constituent then definitely. And last but not least, he burgled the museum and the museum shop. What do I do here, since I have the word "and" in there? Yes, coordination. So everything that I can sort of coordinate with a similar pattern also is a constituent. These are the things we use to identify phrases and larger units. Yeah, that's just a summary of these. Now, again a bit on burglar Bill. Let's go a bit deeper. We've looked at clauses, we say the clause is the biggest constituent, and we've looked at constituents. Now we'll look at the function of each. So what I'd like you to do for these sentences is find the verb, for one thing, and then find the other constituents that fulfill syntactic functions. Do we remember the syntactic functions as opposed to the syntactic classes? So, museum, we said, is a noun. The museum in this case is a noun phrase, but what is the syntactic function of the museum in that sentence? Yeah. The object, yes. So, let's try to analyze the syntactic functions for these sentences.
All right, so how many phrases does the first one have? How many bits do you have in there? Four, yes. It's not giving us this yet. So burglar Bill burgled the museum last night, and then we have the museum and last night. For the second one, we have he gave, and then his loot, and then to his younger sister. Then we have that made her very happy. She cried, and then from that point on, he was her favorite brother. So we said, what do they then actually do? What is the museum? Oh yeah, we already said that's the object, and in this case the direct object, right? What is burglar Bill? Subject, yes. What is he? Yes. What is his loot? The direct object. What is his younger sister? The indirect object, yes. That. Subject, indeed. Sounds odd, but yes. What about her? Direct object, yes. Now very tricky. What is very happy? Yeah. Yes, indeed, that is a compliment. And what kind of compliment? What does it complement here? What, the object, yes. Because it's not that becomes happy, but she. So he made her very happy. That's my object, and that's my object complement that goes with it, right? Then we have she, subject, he, subject, her favorite brother. Perfect. That is the subject complement, because again, we sort of have an equation between he and her favorite brother, but in this case it's an equation between the subject and the complement, and she is happy, so it's between the object and the complement, right? Now, these green things, these are the obligatory parts, right? I cannot just say, he gave. I need both the lute and I need the sister. I cannot just say, that maid. I need somebody and I need something that she then is. He was alone is maybe a bit philosophically existential, but we would expect something to come after. These obligatory bits are different from the sort of non-obligatory bits. Things like last night or from that point on. These we want for information purposes, so it's not like we can just leave them out, but for grammatical purposes, we can leave them out. Whoops. So these obligatory elements we call, oddly, complements, and don't let that confuse you with subject complement and object complement. And the ones that are sort of optional, we call adjuncts. And the idea is that every sentence consists of at least a subject and at least a predicate in English. The predicate being everything after the subject, sort of. Now that from that point on is a bit of a tricky thing, because if it was here, we might say, yes, it's part of the predicate. Some people might say last night is not. So this idea especially applies to the obligatory elements. Now don't let that confuse you. In German, the Prädikat is different from the English predicate. What we call the Prädikat in English, okay. We'll get to that in a second. We call the predicator the German Prädikat. Just don't let that confuse you. So we've talked about these patterns now, and one thing I want to draw your attention to is that here we have subject, verb, direct object, indirect object, as you rightly identified. Now, unmarked, without this being in the text, this is the more unusual construction. More commonly, you would have, I gave the key to my mom. I gave my mom the key, rather than I gave the key to my mom. But in this case, I do have this word order. And this is where I said, okay, we have certain patterns, certain rule ideas in our heads, but we also have others in our heads. Like in this case, do you remember theme rime from language analysis? That usually the thing that I know already, the topic, comes before, and then we get the additional information. And here, because we have a museum burglary, we assume that there's a loot. We assume he got something out of it. So this is already mentioned. And this is new information, that he has a younger sister, and that he gives it to her. So that is why here we have actually an unusual word order, sort of. But it's not very unusual, because we often have context. So this is where two patterns compete, and sometimes one is stronger than the other. Yeah, there we get to the predicator. So for our clause patterns here, I've substituted a verb with predicator, because really that is the syntactic function, right? The verb would be the word class. But for reasons of tradition, often in these patterns we have verb. And what I want you to be aware of is that these are sort of the patterns that English has. Now, other languages might be different, right? There are languages that start with verbs that are a sentence. There's languages that can do without a subject. There are different patterns, but for English, that is more or less it. And the adjuncts you can have in different places. Do you remember the term valency? So verbs have different valencies, meaning how many arguments do they actually need to hold on to. So this one needs the museum, we said, but it also needs a subject. So it needs two things. That's why we say it's bivalent. But it's monotransitive because it only needs one thing within the predicate. Do you remember this? Valency and transitivity? So we can have monotransitive verbs, meaning I need one thing. Ditransitive verbs, meaning I need two things. But I can also have intransitive verbs, like she cried. She cried doesn't need anything else. When we talk about valency, we also count the subject. So then instead of monotransitive, it becomes bivalent. Is that sort of clear? Memory, waking up about that? Good. Okay, we talked about the predicate, we talked about the predicator, we talked about what the predicate can consist of. Talked about arguments, yes. And then a little thing, there's differences in illocutions that I'm sure you're aware of. So we can have declarative sentences, interrogative sentences, imperative sentences, and they're determined by the patterns that I have. Like here, of course, I have the subject-verb-object thing. Here, I must have the verb before the noun for the interrogative. And what is the imperative missing? Yeah, doesn't have a subject. So if we don't have a subject in English and we consider it a full sentence, then it should be an imperative, right? Whereas in Spanish, not really necessary. In Mandarin, not really necessary. Yeah. Now let's look at this bit. I said we'll talk about why follow the lecture is sort of one thing. The idea is that sentences are mainly built up around the verb that I have. And then they hold these different things. They hold their arguments. They have a certain valency. But there is a claim that the link to the object is closer than to the subject. For example, if I look at the sentence, John ate the sandwich quickly. Take the word quickly and see where else you can put it in the sentence. So I can have, quickly John ate the sentence. It's a sandwich. John quickly ate the sandwich. I can have John ate the sandwich quickly, but I cannot really have John ate quickly the sandwich, right? Also, they tend to move together. So if you apply the different constituency tests, you can also see that ate the sandwich is what John did. What did John do? Ate the sandwich. They sort of stick together, but to really have something in between there is sort of tricky. Did I say sentence again? I don't know. Okay. So we said we have syntactic functions, subjects, objects, etc., and syntactic forms, nouns, verbs, adjectives, etc. And what you have to be aware of for this lecture is that there's not a one-to-one relationship here. So one form, the noun phrase, like here bikes, 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 they can have many functions. Bikes are everywhere, the noun phrase functions as subject. Children love their bikes, there it's an object. I can even say it can be a modifier, it can be the bike's black tire is flat, and there I have a noun, but really it modifies the black tire, right? Because then we know what black tire, the one of our bike. So it can do different things. And the same goes the other way around. One function, the subject, can be filled by many forms. Like the bikes, but I can also have a clause like to err is human. And then to err, the entire clause functions as the subject in that sentence, right? And even prepositional phrases like from here to Paris is a long trip. I have a prepositional phrase headed by a preposition, but it's the subject. So, many different ways, many different forms that can fulfill different functions, and many functions that can be fulfilled by different forms. Yeah, we said that actually. And sometimes clauses are adjuncts, obviously, especially dependent clauses. Yeah. These were our general principles, and I hope what you take from that is that grammar is very multi-layered and very complex, and also the bit that grammar rules or patterns or whatever is the difference, they can have, you might say, exceptions, but you might say they're just different rules and sometimes different things apply. So, for example, in general we say, and we just said that English has a subject-verb-object order. But sometimes we have things like this. Hardly had we left the house, or neither, I didn't eat the sandwich, and neither did I eat the sentence, or something like that. So sometimes there here we obviously violate the word order. Here we have the verb, and then we have the subject. And this is one of the things linguists then explored. They said, okay, this seems to be the general pattern, but there's another pattern. So what's the common thing between neither, either, hardly, and so on and so forth. And they concluded, okay, these kind of negative, restricting elements, if I want to use those, then I actually use another pattern, which is unusual, but it's there. Yeah. So English syntax, as I said, treated extensively in language analysis. I do urge you to leaf through your reader if you want to for next time, because these basics need to be there. And we'll just quickly now look at phrase structure, ambiguity, and actually clause patterns we already did. So phrase structure, we said we had different kinds of phrases, noun phrase, verb phrase, prepositional phrase, etc. And they always have to have a head. And conveniently, the head is the thing that gives the phrase the name. So a noun phrase has to have a noun as a head, an adjective phrase an adjective. A prepositional head, even though intuitively it might be odd, the preposition is the head. If I say my book is on the table, then that it's on something is what we assume is the central element, the nucleus, and on what it is sort of the rest, the complement. And we're going to analyze this one sentence now. The 8-year-old son of my neighbor told us very vividly about a new book on knights and medieval castles. So I'll give you 2 minutes to come up with a phrase analysis of this. Again, chatting with your neighbor can be very helpful. Okay. So we at least have a noun phrase in the beginning, right? And then a long verb phrase. So that's my subject and my predicate then, right? But we can split it up further, of course. So 8-year-old, one adjective, one adjectival phrase, which modifies our head, son, of course. And then we have the prepositional phrase, of my neighbor, which also modifies the son. So those two say something about the son, and they're within this big noun phrase. Us, our noun phrase, our direct object. How did he do that? Very vividly, that's our adjectival phrase. Then we have a long prepositional phrase that's headed by the prepositional head about. And then we have the new book and what it's about within the prepositional phrase, where we again have a noun phrase and another prepositional phrase. And within the prepositional phrase, we have another noun phrase. And in the noun phrase, we even have new, which is its own adjectival phrase, of course. So if I'm saying any more phrases, I say that especially because, of course, new alone, again, forms an adjective, and any adjective can be extended into an adjectival phrase, so it could be its own phrase also. So what I'd like you to take from that is their heads, they're most important, they cannot be left out. And depending on what phrase we have, different things are the heads, and the rest are the dependents, the modifiers usually, or determiners or specifiers, depending on what you're talking about. And a phrase can, as we have here, contain other phrases. The big phrase, the big verb phrase told us about a new book on knights and medieval castles, has loads of phrases in it, which we call embedding. And embedding is one of the few things, so I said Chomsky was very concerned with how we arrive from the things in our mind, from the deep structure we have there at the actual sentence. And he said that this is something that should be more or less true for all languages. So he was looking for something that's called universal grammar. And time and again, things have been postulated that actually are universal, and then somebody dug up a language from the Amazons or a First Nation language in Canada or whatever, and said, oh, it's not true there. And one of the few things that remained was actually this idea of embedding, that embedding is really universal. So sentences can always contain smaller elements. And Daniel Everett, quite recently, studied the question Piraha, the language Piraha, which is spoken in the Amazon, and he claims that there you don't even have embedding. Now, generative grammarians nowadays have contested that, and for some good reasons, and for some I don't quite agree with, but even that has been called into question. But the universal grammar thing works well for many European languages at least, and most languages that are studied extensively do have this notion of embedding, and English certainly does. Theoretically, we could construct an endless sentence. And in books, you see that sometimes you have sentences that go on for half a page, or I don't know, if it's Swan's Way, probably 2 pages or something like that. Yeah. Sentence ordering, we've quickly talked about that. Sentence order matters. What I want to draw your attention to here is that that doesn't mean anything goes, right? Even in spoken language, certain things we cannot do. There is something like grammaticality. Even though descriptive linguistics, and especially descriptive linguistics of spoken language, often says, well, it seems like so much is possible, but most people would agree that this is something we couldn't say in the English language. We would probably not accept that, even in a spoken utterance of, well, maybe a very drunk person. But even there, it would be unusual because we wouldn't have these patterns in English. It probably wouldn't even come out when you're smash drunk, because you wouldn't put a verb between a determiner and the noun. This is so deeply entrenched when you speak English, that we have this subject-verb-object thing, that we have a determiner before the noun and maybe an adjective in between, but for sure no verb. Now that's of course not true for all languages, so if your first language was Gaelic, you might utter something like that, because there you have the verb first. Or if your first language is Elvish, then you would probably have your determiner after the noun, because melanin is friend mine, which means my friend. So it depends on what your language is, but once these rules are there, once they're established, you will probably not come up with something that doesn't fit these patterns. And last but not least, sorry, I should have taken that one out, a bit on ambiguity again, which we started out with today. So 2 kinds of ambiguities there. Smile at them a little if you like them, and see if you can tell the difference. Yes, exactly. So the question is, what does in his pajamas belong to? And the linguistic term for this would be, how do we parse it? So if we say, where in the phrase structure does it go, that means parsing it, identifying the phrase structures. So we can parse in his pajamas as being part of the noun phrase, an elephant in his pajamas, being an embedded prepositional phrase that modifies the head. Or we can parse it as Groucho Max having done that whole thing in his pajamas, and then it's more part of the verb phrase rather than part of this noun phrase. And this is what we call structural ambiguity, because there's nothing odd about in his pajamas. There are no two meanings to in his pajamas here. It's just a question, where in the structure does it belong? And that's structural ambiguity as opposed to what we started out with today, semantic ambiguity, where matches, of course, has two meanings in this context. And this is, I think, one of the most cited examples. The French wine merchant is here. Same thing. Depends on, do I parse French as being part of this noun phrase and modifying wine merchant? Or is it this noun phrase modifying the wine? Yeah. All of this you can read up on also in Plague and Yule, chapter 7. Much of this is repetition. What I would like you to definitely read for next time, because neither Yule and Plague really deal properly with syntax, is this article by Becker and Biswanger. You can find the book in the Lehrbuchsammlung, but I've also put the article on Moodle. And this deals with a formal approach, so sort of a development out of Chomsky's approaches, X-bar theory, but also how did they get to X-bar theory. So what you will need to know for the exam is sort of the last bit, but you need it all to get the context. So I really encourage you to read that before the lesson next time. It's online as a PDF, you cannot miss it, it's on the homepage. Because, and now a quick note on your test, because we're getting closer to it. Your test consists of a multiple choice part, where you'll be asked to deal with terms and definitions. So I could, for example, give you a couple of sentences, and then you have a multiple choice section, identify all the dependent clauses, or all the finite dependent clauses, and then you only tick the ones that are finite and dependent. Then there's the transcription bit, that refers to the phonology session in the beginning, as well as the transcription course, which you can practice on your own, but you can also go to the course. And then there's an application section, which is split evenly between morphology, semantics, and syntax, where you'll be asked to write sort of paragraphs to, like, little essays. Essays saying too much, but sort of little paragraphs. And the syntax bit is going to be on the three approaches we're covering. So you have two questions in there, one dealing with one approach, one dealing with the other approach, and the third one you sort of get out of for that exam. So these are also based on the readings, not only on what I tell you here, and not only on Yule and Plague, but also there will be a text for generative cognitive grammar and systemic functional grammar, and you need to read the texts for those. In total, you have to pass all of those three parts in the sense of you have to get at least 40% for these, and overall you need 60% to pass. Yes? This is for any sitting. Oh, sorry. It should say when this is here. I forgot to fill it in. It's the last session. My apologies. That should be clear. This is for all the sittings. And here, it should say whatever our last session is, that's when we have our exam. And what you need for it from today is the difference between syntactic classes and syntactic functions, right? So can you toss some syntactic classes at me? Any syntactic class you can think of? Verb. Noun. Adjective, yeah. Determiner, let's not forget about the determiner. Adverbials, prepositions, right? And what are, on the other hand, syntactic functions? Subject. Anything else? Direct object, yes. And if we have a direct one, we also have the indirect ones, right? Let's not forget about the complements we have. And the predicator, because that's what the verb does, right? Then we had our different clause patterns. So, clause patterns. So what order subject, predicator, objects, and complements can go into. Then we talked about the larger units, The clauses, we said there is dependent and independent ones. They can have finite and non-finite verbs. But the main clause always has to have a finite verb. We also talked about these combinations. So if in a sentence I have only a main clause, what kind of sentence is that? It's an independent clause, yes, the main clause. And what do I call the sentence if there's only a main clause or only an independent clause? Simple, yes. What if I have a main clause and a dependent clause? A main clause and a dependent one, and a subordinate one, sort of. Complex, yes, very good. Complex. What is the compound one? Yeah, two independent ones. Beautiful. Yeah. And remember that forms and functions don't always align. So many different forms can fulfill many functions in the sentence. Remember that a phrase must have a head. So a noun phrase must contain a noun, obviously. A prepositional phrase must contain a preposition, and that's the head. Remember that we have different kinds of verbs. Some hold one argument, some hold two arguments, some hold three arguments. What else would I like you to remember? Yes, and especially the beginning. That there are different ways of studying language, depending what you believe exists, depending on your ontology, depending on what you think, how you can find out about them, or what you can actually find out, being the epistemology, and depending on how you think you can find out. So, depending on that, you might think language is a bunny and a duck, and both are valuable ways of looking at it, because both tell us more about language. But out of these theories, and because they came about in such a, sometimes even like verbally violent way, different approaches grew. So if we have these different approaches that believe different things, and so the theories that grew out of it sometimes contradict each other and are sort of enemies of each other, but a lot of times they can also peacefully coexist because they simply look at different things. Yeah, that's all I have to say for today. Any questions? No? All right, then see you next week.